Cunas T, how are ye? Welcome to the Candlelittales podcast, and this episode is the post-show chat about the death of CúChulainn in the Death series that we're doing at the moment. My name is Aaron Hegarty, and this post-show chat was actually recorded many, many moons ago, before the very first lockdown that we had here in Ireland. And well, we thought it was going to be a bit morose to release straight away, so we decided to postpone it. And then the world kept on getting mental and more mad, and we decided to just release it anyway amongst the Death series that we're releasing at the moment. And well, it's a bit daft, but we thought you might enjoy it, and we didn't edit it because it's just a bit funny. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Patreon and the support we get on patreon.com/candlelittales. Thanks very much, guys, and enjoy the chats.
You're the worst. You're the worst. You're the worst. I'm not putting this in. It's not going into the edit. It's not going into the edit. I'm deleting it. I'm going into the post.
I'm the worst.
He just died.
Poor little
Remember
CúChulainn.
the crying people.
I know. They all cried so much.
Okay.
So did I. I nearly cried. Well. No, I'm sorry.
Okay. What do you want to say? You have to say something.
I know I have to say
after
something.
he died with a smile on his lips is the fucking line.
Okay.
He died with a smile on his lips.
Morley had that going for him, I guess.
This was a mistake. This was a mistake.
This was a terrible mistake.
I want to go see Junior Brother.
Listen, I know, I'm sorry. Look, I just can't think of any. Do you know what? I'm going to get it all out now. I'm going to say all the things that are a terrible joke.
Do you want me to break the ice and just start
Just
the
go.
conversation?
Sure, look it.
No.
The poor wee lad. God help him.
Get it out.
I'm getting it out of my system so that I can be serious after I make all the jokes about. Sure, look it. God love him. Wasn't he a grand little wee fella altogether? Didn't he do his best? Wasn't he lovely? See, I'm done now. I got the giggles out. It worked.
Good.
You can break the ice though, because I don't know what to say. What do I say?
Okay. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as you can do a death story. It's a little bit morose, but yeah, I guess the idea was to try and put it all together in one story. The life and death of CúChulainn.
Yeah. It's a heavy story.
It is a bit.
I think it's a really interesting story though, because CúChulainn was always one of my favourites, and I have had many discussions with people who don't like CúChulainn very much.
Yeah, you've mentioned this, and that's kind of what I'm going to base this post-show talk about, because we actually performed this live recently, second last week in January in Stag's Head, and it's very interesting telling these stories, especially the very dramatic ones, to a live group, and you get the laughter and the giggles and the fun stuff and the sexual references at the start of the show, and then you end up with the heavy looking back over a life of a tragedy, the fact that he'd killed his best friend, he'd killed his own son, and all of his life was just this miserable thing, and it wasn't the heroic, idealistic life that he thought he lived to.
That's the thing that, I think that's the thing that a lot of the CúChulainn detractors don't like about the CúChulainn stories, and how well they are, relatively well known they are in Ireland. Because in as much as Irish people know Irish mythology, most people have heard of the Children of Lear, they've heard of Fionn McCool, they've heard of CúChulainn. And that's kind of about it for a lot of us. But, he's one of the relatively better known figures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think on a very shallow knowledge of the story, it seems like a story about the glory of war.
Sure.
And my big thing with the Táin was always, but hang on, at the end of this war, they're left with nothing.
Absolutely.
Nobody wins. How is that a glorification of war? And in one way, you can't really say for sure how our ancestors who told these stories and listened to them were actually interpreting.
And we know in 1916 the glorification of the archetype and the warrior was certainly used to inspire young men and boys to go into battle essentially and die
also
for Ireland.
All of the women who were also fighting in 1916.
Sorry.
That always get forgotten about.
Sorry.
I mean, no, but come on. Not as many of them died, which is true. But yeah, like, no, it was, and that was like, it was a kind of propaganda story, and like, it's one of the really interesting features of the conflict in Northern Ireland that both sides have used the CúChulainn figure as a kind of a propaganda piece.
Yeah, because he represents, solidarity. He represents fighting against an opposition.
On the one hand, he represents the defence of Ulster.
Yeah.
And it has always been the kind of rallying cry of like the Northern Ireland Protestant community that like Ulster will stand. And on the other hand, he's Irish.
Yeah, so it was before
and he was came, so. Way before most Northern Irish Protestants are Scottish in origin.
True.
So he was there predating.
Isn't it?
Well, this is all the British Isles.
Oh, you're fucking right. Don't you call me British though?
Well, obviously. But he's an interesting figure in that way, and like the legend of CúChulainn has been used to inspire war, and I think that's why like we've always been interested in the other side of that story, because you can also read it as an absolute critique of war.
Yeah.
Because this is a character who gives everything to war and the warrior code, and like he's within a culture that values victory at any cost.
Yeah, that's the important thing.
But victory at any cost.
Okay.
So there's a point in the Táin where he shames himself in front of Fergus McRoy. He runs away. And that's kind of an unheard of thing for a warrior to do.
Yeah.
Like it's a difficult struggle for him to decide to do that, but he does it. And he's kind of the only person who can do that and take the reputational hit, because most people don't. Whereas then you also get a character like Cúchulainn MacDara who finds him sleeping at another point in the Táin and says, I'm not going to kill him because he's not on his feet, and it wouldn't be glorious. But like there's only the very, very honourable will do that. Most people are quite comfortable. Like there's a story of Celtcar MacUthergar. He's perfectly happy killing a guy who's drugged asleep. In a really macabre way, and that's kind of fine. And even when CúChulainn kills Cúchulainn MacDara, he's tied to a bed. It's not a fair fight. But there's a kind of, the ethos there is about win. Doesn't matter how you win, just fucking win.
Yeah, and that's the problem with this. Like, okay, you're kind of valorizing the hero, and you're talking about, oh, what a great character he is. But actually, when you look at it, he's using kind of tricks. He's using the gay bulga. He's using a better weapon. He's unfairly.
Because in that culture, in our culture, back in those days, that didn't matter. Didn't matter if you won by trickery. Because you know what? If you won by trickery, you were you defeated someone by wit.
Yeah. Okay.
Which means you still fucking won, didn't you?
Yeah.
If I stab you in the back, it's because you were fool enough to turn your fucking back to me. So that's on you. You know what I mean? Like there's a whole, like, this is what I mean by interpreting it. Like we can only guess at how people were interpreting it then. Yeah. And that's part of the stuff that we do, is we find our own way of reinterpreting it.
Yeah.
And to me, the CúChulainn story has always been a tragic story about an overachiever who tries to do everything that his culture expects of him to do in order to win their glory and win their approval and win their respect. And as inevitably happens when your kind of locus of self-esteem is external, he's brutalised for it.
As you're talking there, you've reminded me of when I heard you telling this story up in the Arthur's Bar in Dublin. I had just come back from travelling. It was January 2 years ago. I think it was in Morocco. I came back anyway, and I was sitting kind of, after a long day travelling, kind of like getting to a plane, getting to a taxi, just going through kind of like the 2 days of preparation that you kind of forget about the world, our emotions, and just hearing the myth and going back into the CúChulainn story just drastically and rapidly brought me into feeling that I'd been very divorced from, because I was there imagining this boy, this young character who was, after basically the most tragic fucking life. Constantly thinking, I can't remember the phrase you put to it, but the way he had been constantly brought up thinking he'd be brilliant, and then to look back and not think about it at all as a brilliant thing that he'd done,
Yeah.
and then suddenly see it as a fucking mess. Like,
Well, like, I also think, like, that's one of the reasons I connected to CúChulainn
Yeah.
when I first read myths as a kid. Because I was one of those kids that was given the fucking designation of bright, which is a terrible thing to do to a kid.
right?
Because,
Yeah.
you know,
Destined to fail then.
Well, no, not quite. It's,
Not live up to the expectations.
yeah, there's a couple of issues with it. One of them is if you're told that you're bright, you don't. Kids who are told that they are bright. I'm going to generalize this out for a little bit.
Sure.
Kids who are told that they are bright tend to have difficulty with work ethic. Because if you're told, okay, you're good at English because you're clever, if you then run into a problem with something, you go, oh, that's because I'm bad at this. It becomes an inherent quality. You're either bright or you're not, right?
Are you
So-
excusing the lack of study?
Well, no, this is actually something that I discovered as an adult, and I was like, oh, that fucking makes sense of a lot of my behaviour as a teenager.
Right, yeah.
Because this is a tendency with kids who are told in school that they're bright, that they then become very shy of trying things. Because if you're not good at it immediately, it means you're stupid, right? And that becomes your kind of, you get this whole like lot of stuff that happens. And when you've got a kid who's told that they're great
Exceptional at
and
everything.
exceptional, there's also a lot of expectation. So there's two problems. There's a massive fear of failure, and there's a massive lot of expectation. And then there's also this like huge misunderstanding of the value of hard work.
Yeah, I think the opposite then is true for the ones that are called dim or you know,
Absolutely.
or you have to work hard and they become
Well,
dogged and
Actually, one of the best things you can do for a kid is to tell them that they need to work hard.
yeah,
Because then they realise they need to work hard.
sure.
You need to try hard. You need to focus. That's actually a really good thing. That's actually a very positive thing to say to a
aren't
kid.
you so amazing and brilliant and talented
Yeah.
and clever?
Whereas if you say, as you say, if you either say like, "Oh, you're great," or "Oh, you're bad at this," both of
Yeah,
those are
they're both negative.
demotivating.
Yeah.
Well, they're both demotivating
Right.
because they both mean that it's not under your control whether you're good or bad at this. Whereas if you say to a kid, "You need to work hard,"
Sure,
that just means cool. I haven't worked hard enough. I
you
need
have
to try hard again.
take control over the situation
Yeah.
and
It's in your hands.
Figure it out. Yeah.
You can do it or not do it. And like that was the interesting thing to me about the CúChulainn character, because he's a character who's gifted, and he's a character who's told he's destined for great things. And you see him having the kinds of difficulties that gifted kids have, in that he doesn't have any friends.
Leg being the one.
Yeah, Leg is the one, and Leg is kind of like, Leg is also a social inferior. Leg is his charioteer,
Yeah.
which means they're not really on a par. Leg is the one who's allowed to insult him. Imagine if you only had one friend who was allowed to insult you.
Fuck that.
Because
I basically build my friendships around people who slag me.
Exactly. Like,
That's how I know we're friends.
that's how Irish people know they're friends, is you take the piss out of each other.
Yeah.
Because you can't actually effectively take the piss out of somebody you're annoyed with.
Yeah.
You just end up getting too harsh and hurting their feelings.
Yeah.
It's a very, very subtle tool of communication.
It's a fine line.
It's a very fine line. But
Fickle.
it's also
The
it's also
Irish are
very
fickle.
it's a very well calibrated test of actually how good your relationship is.
I wish they could see the claw hand that you're making when you're doing that.
Because you take it right to the edge, man. You take it right to the edge and then you pull it back just a hair, and that's how you know that you love each other.
You see.
But yeah, like the CúChulainn thing, I think is really interesting, and he's also got this huge like imposter syndrome thing that I think you also get with a lot of like overachiever types, because he never thinks he's good enough.
Yeah, I love that story in the Champions portion of the wheel toss. It just so summarises his like, view on life and how he's not good enough.
Yeah, like everybody else throws it up and does a shit job and gets booed and walks away thinking they're great. And he throws it up and gets a great cheer and walks away thinking, oh, fuck, they were laughing.
Yeah.
I didn't do it.
Didn't do it well enough, or he should have caught it, not let it fucking
And
the floor.
the critique thing of like, oh, I should, like, you know, when you go back over and you're like, I should have done that better. So like I always had a massive sympathy for CúChulainn, and like I think that's why when people critique the CúChulainn stories, I tend to take it a little personally.
Well, it was interesting doing the live show in January and putting together like the number of stories of the heroes of the Ulster Cycle and CúChulainn's, because you kind of can't tell his death without at least harking back and looking at his life.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, of course, you can tell the death story from just that point in the story when he's in the hall of Gror Magnassa, but you have to give some form of context. And looking back, and all you see is just tragedy.
Yeah.
Like there's not one happy story.
And I like the other thing that's really interesting about the death story of CúChulainn, when you put it up against the other death stories.
Oh, it's a non-thing.
It's such an anticlimax.
Which again is where I saw you lean a couple of years ago into that tragedy of it, of like, he's going to do that great thing, he's finally going to do it, he's about to do it, yes, what the fuck is it? Oh crap, I ate some dog food.
Like, it's nothing, I'm going to get killed on the road to the battle.
Yeah.
By some guy who first kills my only friend and my best horse.
Yeah.
Like everything is taken away from him, everything he has left.
Literally.
And like, you know, when you go back to the as much as I love the character of Emer, the Emer CúChulainn marriage is a later addition.
Sure.
And if you go back to the earlier versions of the CúChulainn stories, she's not there.
That's very interesting. You mentioned that earlier because we have a little weird thing with the time on this.
Well, there is a weird thing with the time on this, because that's the kind of classic timeline of CúChulainn, is that he's 3 sevens.
Sure.
He takes up arms at the age of 7. He fights Ferdia at the ford at the age of 14. And he dies at the age of 21.
Yeah. And that makes absolutely no sense if he had a child that he fought in Ballystrand at whatever amount of years before that, unless he was fighting a 14-year-old.
I mean, he's possibly
a 7-year-old.
Well, no, he's potentially, if he fathers Conla before the Tawn, so he would have been 12 or 13. Could have been as young as 11.
Sure.
Biologically, that's possible, although it's fucking icky to think about. And then if he fought Conla when he was 20, Conla's like 9. And he himself took up arms and killed 3 grown men at the age of 7.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I constantly kind of look at the Heracles myth in Greek mythology. I'm like, okay, he grew extremely quickly. He grew into a giant of a man before he was really a boy, and
there's
the godlike blood thing going through.
There's definitely like that's kind of no, that it isn't implied in the CúChulainn story, because somebody did tell me that there's apparently a gene for gigantism in the north of Ireland, which I like was kind of like, oh right, so there could have been like every now and again a kid would be born, and by the time they're 7 they're the size of a man,
right? And
by the time they're 14 they're a fucking giant, and by the time they're 21 they're dying,
because that's what happens with giants.
Because like that's you know, that's
big dogs have a very short life.
It has such it's so difficult on the system, but like, and like in that, you know, in a pre-medical culture, wouldn't have been able to do fucking anything for people. But it's also the myths about CúChulainn always describe him as being small and slight. Yeah,
that's what doesn't quite equate with that. Well, I mean, when you mention giant, I'm like, that sounds like Conal Carnac, the big, massive brute of a fella, and that the legend makes sense. Then CúChulainn was always slight until he got angry. He
like
hulked out.
He's not a like. That's what I always think is interesting about, you know, we've talked about this. I don't know if we've ever talked about this in the podcast before, but we've certainly had this conversation about like artistic interpretations of CúChulainn.
Yes.
Because they are almost always beefcakes.
It's so funny, and like we've met artists who've designed beautiful images of CúChulainn, and again beefcake, like and
it's
there's
like,
a brilliant comic book, Coo, and it's visually stunning, but at the same time it's a big hulk of a fella, and I'm kind of like, but he was a boy for the Tawn.
Yeah, like, and he's also always described as being small, slight, and beautiful. Mm-hmm. He's not called handsome. they have a word for handsome. Fergus McRoy gets called handsome.
Yeah.
You know? CúChulainn gets called beautiful.
Beautiful, yeah.
Like
he's effeminate. Like
he is almost effeminate. He's young and he's small and he's like this is the whole, like, there's a whole comic book aesthetic that is very on like male power fantasy physiques, and there's a really interesting thing as well in Irish myth where you get certain characters who are very much feminine ideals of masculine beauty rather than masculine ideals of masculine beauty.
Yeah, that's
and
funny.
like someone like Diarmid is another example of that. Like
Again.
he's another beautiful man.
Gorgeous.
Like, and he's gorgeous, and he's not a big hulk of a fella.
No.
He's a the swimmer's build. That's apparently the most popular physique with women. Like, it's not the fucking bodybuilder.
Jesus, they're big enough
muscles
lads,
on
them
muscles.
swimmers. Your man Phelps, like, he's a big lad. I wouldn't mess with him.
But you know what I'm talking about, the bodybuilder
Yeah. True,
aesthetic
true.
versus the like
slim,
lean,
yeah.
slender guy.
Slipstream type thing.
Yeah, like there's a whole kind of idea about that I think is really interesting because it tells you something about who's telling those stories.
And again, we're constantly talking about the culture that these stories are in, and essentially CúChulainn was the outcome of a culture of the time that he was in, that the hero, the archetype, the battle, the winner, the come over the object with adversity and challenge it with aggression and come over that.
Do you mean overcome?
Overcome, thank you, God.
Jesus Christ, aren't
I'm really tired. I had a lot of coffee earlier in the morning.
I know, I gave you some of it.
But he's the product of a culture that represents...
And that was kind of always my ultimate defense of CúChulainn, is like, you can't have a go at CúChulainn without, like, he's a product of a culture and he's a child.
Yeah.
Like, you don't get to a point where you can start looking at your culture and unpacking it and like unpacking your own shit until you're at least the rest of your fucking neocortex is finished growing in, which it hasn't by the time you're 21.
Absolutely not. Like our father gave a very interesting talk done in school in December in a secondary school as a psychotherapist, and he was talking about that exact thing of teenage boys especially being designed for adrenaline rushes, desire, they're lusting after things, they're not thinking about a consequence. There is
they don't, like, teenagers, boys and girls, don't have the bit of their brain that understands actions and consequences grown in yet.
Yeah. And so it's so evident with CúChulainn because he's just like, yeah, let's go do the thing. I'm fighting, whatever, fuck it, it's fine.
And like, that's the three faults.
It's the realization that he has at the very, very end. You're like, oh, right, war, who, huh, what is a good...
I can't believe you made that joke. You always yell at me for making that joke. But yes, I mean, those are the flaws of CúChulainn. Too young, too daring, too beautiful.
I mean, look, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. It was brought to you by myself and my sister and the Shafas and Oisin.
Yes, and also our Patreon patrons.
Yay!
Because they're great and they give us money. And they also just give us their support. And we have gotten a little bit better at giving them some stuff back. So if you
sent out some tote bags to you recently, those who joined in November.
We also have the...
After I lost all of the merchandise in my attic. Found it again though.
I wasn't gonna give you any shit about that, but you did it all on your own.
I mean, I deserve shit for that.
You do. I've given you plenty of shit for that, and not on the podcast. We also have uploaded all of the outtakes from our 5-part Tone special. So all of the conversation in between those recordings, all of the bits where we talk about what we're doing next.
I don't think anyone wants to listen
to it. Listen, it's quite entertaining. You can listen to it if you want to. But you know, it's kind of a little behind the scenes look at the process of actually recording stories.
True.
And we'll also have more of the Just the Story podcast going up on there.
Absolutely.
And some other bonus content. So if you're interested in getting a little bit more of that, go to patreon.com and give us literally whatever you can, because there's no tiers.
There's no tiers, which is kind of like, if you want to support and get some free content, nice one. We're all about, if you have it, give it. If you don't, feck it, you're grand.
And if you don't, thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Because as Aaron discovered earlier, there's no crack telling a story
It is shite.
in an empty room.
Oh, the Shafis it gave me nothing. Literally gave me fuck all feedback. I might as well have been talking to a wall.
He was talking to the interior wall of the Shafis.
It's not really a wall, though, is it? It's barely a bit. The shed.
Sheds have walls.
No, they don't. They're kind of containers of a shed. Anyway, she's winding me up. I'm not gonna jump. I'm not gonna bite for it. Thank you very much for listening. Is there anything else we need to say? Probably not. I think we've covered it. Next podcast will be Trefungled Treocker, I believe.
Something like that.
And if you were at the Sugar Club recently and you enjoyed all of the women who supported and performed, as well as the lads for Women and Warriors, well, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the support. As always, keep her lit, keep her candle lit. You.